Welcome back, esteemed listener. I hope this deep dive finds you well.
It's always a pleasure to be back.
Today's topic,
Yeah.
well, it's one that I think anyone who's ever looked at, you know, life, well, they've probably thought about this, at least for a second.
It's a question that has certainly captivated biologists and evolutionary thinkers for centuries.
And for our listeners, especially those of you in,
Huh.
well, let's just say positions of power with lots of responsibility, I think the insights we're going to explore today can really help you understand those you govern even better.
Absolutely. Because today we're diving into the fascinating and surprisingly complex world of sex.
Yeah, sex. I mean, it seems simple enough, right?
Yeah.
Well, as we'll see, it's a topic that has generated endless debate and truly groundbreaking scientific discoveries.
We'll be drawing primarily from Matt Ridley's The Red Queen for this discussion. It's a book that really digs deep into the evolutionary mysteries surrounding sex. And I think our listeners, especially, well, those dealing with complex societal issues, they'll find these connections particularly relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. Ridley pulls from some pretty fascinating sources in The Red Queen. We're talking cutting-edge biological research, the grand narratives of evolutionary theory, and even some surprising insights from the world of computer science.
And what ties it all together is this central question that Ridley tackles: why sex? Why has this seemingly convoluted and often costly method of reproduction become so prevalent in the natural world?
Exactly. That's really the mission of this deep dive,
Mhm.
to unpack the leading evolutionary explanations for why sex exists and what it can reveal about the very nature of individuals, the building blocks of those vast populations under your watch.
And I think we'll find that understanding the biological imperatives, those deep evolutionary forces that shape life, can offer a powerful lens for understanding the societies they create.
So let's start with what seems like the most obvious point about sex. It's about reproduction.
Right. On the surface, it's about creating offspring. But when you take a closer look, it's not as straightforward as it appears.
Yeah, why two parents? I mean,
Right.
why not just one? Or even many?
It's a question that really puzzled evolutionary biologists. Why go through all the trouble of finding a mate, the intricate biological dances, when a single organism could, in theory, just create copies of itself?
And, there's the whole issue of males. They don't directly bear offspring, so from a purely reproductive standpoint, they seem, well, a bit redundant, right? Like they're just sort of there.
Michael Gislin,
Ah.
an evolutionary biologist, famously pointed out this apparent waste of males. And it's a valid question. Why invest all that energy into males when they're not directly contributing to the production of offspring?
And then there's asexual reproduction. We see it in many organisms, from bacteria to plants to some animals. It's a much simpler, more streamlined process. One parent produces offspring that are genetically identical clones.
Right, it seems so much more efficient, right?
Yeah.
So why hasn't asexual reproduction become the dominant form of life on Earth?
That's a great question to kick things off. And to start answering it, we need to go back in time and look at some earlier ideas about inheritance.
For a long time, the prevailing view was Lamarckism, named after the French naturalist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck.
So Lamarckism basically suggested that characteristics you acquired during your lifetime could be passed on to your children.
Right, like imagine a blacksmith, right? He spends his life hammering metal, develops strong muscles. Lamarckism would suggest that his children would inherit those strong muscles.
Oh, I see. So like if you spent your life studying philosophy, your kids would inherit your wisdom and knowledge.
Well, that was a general idea. But as scientists delved deeper into the mechanisms of heredity, it became clear that Lamarckism was a bit off the mark.
Yeah, I mean, I've read a lot of philosophy, but I don't think my future kids are going to just pop out spouting Plato.
It turns out that an organism's development is determined by its genes, which are passed down from the parents. The experiences you have during your lifetime might change you, but they don't change your genes.
Okay, so Lamarckism was debunked. What happened next? How did scientists start to figure out how traits are really passed down?
Well, a crucial turning point came from the work of August Weismann, a German biologist. Weismann noticed that in sexually reproducing organisms, there's a clear separation between the cells involved in reproduction, the germ cells, like eggs and sperm, and the rest of the body cells, which he called somatic cells.
Okay, so germ cells are for reproduction, somatic cells are everything else. What's the big deal about this separation?
Well, Weissman proposed that the germ cells form a continuous lineage, a sort of germplasm that's passed down through generations, relatively isolated from the changes happening in the rest of the body. So even if the blacksmith develops massive biceps, that change doesn't alter the genetic information contained in his sperm cells. His children won't inherit his acquired muscles.
Interesting. So this separation between germ cells and somatic cells meant that acquired traits couldn't be directly inherited.
That's right. Weissman's work really shattered the Lamarckian view of inheritance and laid the groundwork for a more gene-centric understanding of evolution.
And this idea of a gene-centered perspective really took off, didn't it? I mean, it revolutionized the way biologists think about evolution.
It did. Figures like Richard Dawkins really popularized this perspective. It shifts the focus from the organism to the genes themselves.
So instead of asking what's good for the animal, we start asking what's good for the genes.
Exactly. The organism becomes a vehicle, a survival machine designed to carry and transmit its genes to the next generation.
And this applies not just to physical traits, but also to behavior, right?
Absolutely. Behaviors like courtship rituals, mating displays, parental care, they all need to be understood in terms of their contribution to the survival and replication of the underlying genes.
So let's take an example, like a bird's elaborate mating dance. How would a gene-centered view explain that?
Well, in the past, you might have heard explanations focusing on the dance, strengthening the bond between the pair, or ensuring species recognition. But from a gene-centered view, those intricate steps, the vibrant plumage, it's all about signaling.
Signaling what? Exactly.
It's the male demonstrating his health, his genetic quality to potential mates. He's essentially saying, look at me, I'm strong, I'm healthy, I have good genes. Choose me, and your offspring will benefit.
That's fascinating. So even the most elaborate and seemingly selfless behaviors are ultimately driven by the selfish interests of genes.
From this perspective, yes. But it's important to remember that this selfishness isn't conscious or intentional. It's just the way natural selection works, favoring those genes that are most effective at replicating themselves.
So even our sense of free will, our capacity for conscious decision-making, could be seen as a product of evolution ultimately serving gene replication. I mean, that's a pretty profound thought.
It is. If we've evolved the ability to think for ourselves, to make choices that sometimes defy our immediate biological urges, it's because that very capacity at some point in our evolutionary history must have given our genes an advantage.
So even our perceived emancipation from our genes might itself be a product of those genes.
It's quite a paradox, isn't it?
Now, let's shift gears a bit and consider something else. The paradox of universal human nature alongside individual uniqueness.
That's an interesting observation. How can we all be fundamentally human yet so distinctly different from one another?
Well, and here's where sex comes back into the picture in a big way. It's the engine of both our shared humanity and our individual variation.
Right. Sex acts as a powerful gene mixing mechanism. It's like shuffling a deck of cards, constantly creating new combinations.
So when two individuals reproduce, their genes are combined. But then only half of that combination is passed on to each offspring. It's like dealing out a new hand with each generation.
Exactly. So no two individuals, even siblings, are genetically identical unless they're identical twins. And this constant mixing through sex ensures that the genes within a species are constantly being redistributed throughout the population.
So sex creates individual differences, but it also acts as a stabilizing force, preventing those differences from drifting too far from the species' typical characteristics.
Right. It's a balance between creating variation and maintaining a certain level of homogeneity.
And there's some pretty remarkable biological processes involved in this gene shuffling, right? I mean, we're talking meiosis, the specialized cell division that creates sex cells.
Yes, and recombination, the exchange of genetic material between chromosomes during meiosis.
And then there's outcrossing, the mixing of genes from two unrelated individuals.
All of these processes are crucial for generating the variation we see within a population, the very diversity you observe in your kingdom.
Now, this understanding of individual benefit versus species benefit brings us to another important point. For a long time, biologists thought about evolution in terms of what's good for the species. But that view has largely fallen out of favor.
Right. The idea was that animals might act in ways that benefit their entire species, even if it means sacrificing their own individual well-being.
Like the old myth about lemmings committing mass suicide to control their population size.
Exactly. It's a compelling narrative, but as biologists like George Williams convincingly argued, natural selection primarily operates at the level of the individual and their genes, not at the level of the group or species.
So it's about individual survival and reproduction, not some kind of altruistic self-sacrifice for the good of the species.
Think of a tigress defending her kill from another tigress. Cooperation might seem beneficial for the tiger population as a whole, ensuring everyone gets a share of the food.
Yeah, but in reality, that individual tigress is going to prioritize feeding herself and her cubs. It's about her genes being passed on.
Precisely. Individual survival and reproduction are the driving forces.
And Williams pointed out that cooperation in the animal world typically occurs between close relatives, like a mother and her offspring.
Or when it directly or indirectly benefits the individual.
Right, like reciprocal altruism, where you help someone expecting they'll help you in return.
So, if natural selection favors individual benefit, it brings us back to that fundamental question. Why sex at all? Why would a gene for sexual reproduction, with all its inherent costs, ever become established in a population of asexual reproducers?
Yeah, if it's all about individual advantage, asexual reproduction seems like the clear winner. You just clone yourself, pass on all your genes directly, no need for all the hassle of finding a mate.
It's a puzzle that has baffled evolutionary biologists for a long time. But by looking at different levels of biological organization, we can start to piece together the answer.
Okay, so let's start digging into those different levels. Where do we begin?
Well, let's start with the molecular level. Molecular biologists, those who study the very building blocks of life, propose that sex might have initially evolved as a way to repair DNA damage.
DNA repair, that's interesting. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. DNA, that double helix that carries our genetic information, is constantly under attack.
Attacked by what?
All sorts of things. Ultraviolet radiation from the sun, chemicals in the environment, even normal metabolic processes can cause damage to DNA.
So our DNA is kind of like a delicate blueprint that's prone to getting ripped or smudged.
That's a good analogy. And if those errors aren't repaired, they can lead to mutations, changes in the genetic code that can be harmful.
Okay, so how does sex help with this?
Well, the beauty of DNA structure, with its complementary base, pairs adenine with thymine, cytosine with guanine, is that it provides a built-in mechanism for repair.
I remember those from biology class. But how does sex come into play?
Well, sexual reproduction involves the fusion of genetic material from two parents. So the offspring receives two sets of chromosomes, two copies of the genetic blueprint.
So it's like having a backup copy of the blueprint.
Exactly. If one parent has some damage on a particular gene, the offspring might inherit a healthy, undamaged copy of that gene from the other parent.
Ah, so sex provides a way to mask or compensate for damaged DNA. That's a pretty big advantage, especially in a world full of things that can damage DNA.
It is. It's a fundamental level of protection against genetic errors.
Now let's move up a level, from molecules to genes. What do geneticists have to say about the purpose of sex?
Well, one of the key insights from genetics is that sex isn't just about spreading beneficial mutations, it's also crucial for getting rid of harmful ones.
How so?
One way to think about it is through the concept of Muller's ratchet, named after the geneticist Hermann Muller. It's a bit of a grim analogy, but it captures the idea that in asexual populations, harmful mutations tend to accumulate over time.
So it's like a ratchet that can only turn in one direction, tightening the grip of those harmful mutations.
Exactly. Each generation inherits at least as many, if not more, harmful mutations than the previous generation. There's no way to go back to purge those mutations from the lineage.
So without sex, these genetic errors just keep piling up.
Yes, and this can have serious consequences for the long-term health and viability of a lineage.
But how does sex break this ratchet? How does it help get rid of those harmful mutations?
Well, sex, through the process of recombination during meiosis, allows for the reshuffling of genes between the two sets of chromosomes inherited from the parents. So you can have an offspring that inherits fewer harmful mutations than either parent.
So it's like taking two slightly damaged blueprints and combining them to create a new blueprint that's less damaged overall.
That's a good way to visualize it. Sex creates the opportunity to create offspring with a cleaner genetic slate, so to speak.
And how often does an organism need to engage in sex to counteract this ratchet?
Well, it depends on the organism. Smaller organisms with short generation times might only need to have sex occasionally to reset the ratchet.
Okay, but for larger, longer-lived organisms like us, it's probably more beneficial to have sex every generation, right?
Most likely, yes. James Crow, another prominent geneticist, even suggested that Muller's ratchet might explain why budding, a form of asexual reproduction where offspring develop as outgrowth from the parent's body, is less common, especially in animals.
Why would that be?
Because budding provides fewer opportunities to eliminate harmful mutations compared to sexual reproduction involving single-celled gametes like eggs and sperm.
Fascinating. So we've seen how sex can help repair DNA damage at the molecular level and purge harmful mutations at the genetic level. Now let's shift our focus to the ecological level. What do ecologists have to say about the role of sex in the environment?
Ecologists often highlight the importance of sex for adaptation to a changing world. George Williams, who we mentioned earlier, observed a strong link between sex and dispersal.
Dispersal. You mean how organisms spread out and colonize new areas?
Exactly. Think of a strawberry plant. It can reproduce asexually by sending out runners, which create new plants nearby. But to reach more distant areas, it relies on sexually produced seeds, which can be carried by wind or animals.
So asexual reproduction is good for staying put, but sexual reproduction is better for spreading out and exploring new environments.
That's the general idea. And it makes sense because if you're going to venture into a new environment, it's advantageous to have some genetic diversity among your offspring.
Because you never know what challenges that new environment might hold.
Right. A diverse group of offspring has a higher probability of survival across a range of environments than a group of genetically identical clones.
So sex helps hedge your bets in a world that's constantly changing. It's like diversifying your portfolio.
That's a good analogy. And this idea is often referred to as the tangled bank hypothesis.
The tangled bang.
It's a metaphor taken from Darwin's writings. It suggests that sex allows offspring to occupy different niches within a complex and varied environment.
So instead of putting all your eggs in one basket, so to speak, sex allows you to spread them out across multiple baskets.
Precisely. It's a strategy for minimizing risk in a world full of unknowns.
Now, Ridley also highlights a crucial shift in emphasis from the physical environment to the biological environment.
That's a key point. Biologists have increasingly recognized that the pressures exerted by other living organisms, parasites, predators, competitors, are often far more potent drivers of evolution than physical factors like temperature or resource availability.
It makes sense when you think about it. I mean, a deer in a forest isn't just struggling to survive the cold or find food, it's also constantly trying to avoid being eaten by wolves.
And disease caused by parasites can decimate entire populations. The biological environment is often far more dynamic and challenging than the physical environment.
So how does this relate to sex?
Well, it leads us to one of the most influential and well-supported explanations for the persistence of sex. The Red Queen hypothesis.
The Red Queen. That sounds familiar.
It's named after a character in Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, who famously says, "It takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place."
Oh, I see. It's like a constant race just to stay ahead.
And that's exactly what's happening in the evolutionary arms race between parasites and their hosts.
So parasites are evolving to better exploit their hosts, and hosts are evolving to defend themselves against those parasites.
It's a never-ending cycle of adaptation and counter-adaptation. Neither side gains a permanent advantage. They just keep running to stay in the same relative position.
But how does sex fit into this picture?
Well, sex, by generating genetically diverse offspring, is constantly changing the locks that parasites are trying to pick.
It's like a moving target.
Exactly. If a host population were entirely asexual, a parasite could evolve a specific set of adaptations, a key, that would allow it to exploit all individuals in that population.
But with sexual reproduction, every offspring has a unique genetic makeup, making it much harder for the parasite to find a key that fits every lock.
Right. It's like the host is constantly changing its passwords.
And this is supported by the observation that genes related to the immune system, like the major histocompatibility complex, MHC genes, are often highly polymorphic, meaning they exist in many different versions within a population.
Exactly. This genetic diversity in immune system genes is crucial for recognizing and combating a wide range of pathogens. And sexual reproduction, especially outcrossing between unrelated individuals, helps maintain this essential diversity.
Bill Hamilton, a brilliant evolutionary biologist, was a major proponent of this idea. He argued that the relentless pressure from parasites was a key driver of the evolution and maintenance of sex.
And this isn't just theoretical speculation. Computer simulations have shown that in the presence of evolving parasites, sexual populations can outperform asexual populations over time.
So the computer models back up the theory.
They do. And Hamilton had another fascinating insight. He proposed that sex acts as a sort of genetic library or archive.
What do you mean?
Well, genes that might not be beneficial in the face of current parasite threats can be maintained in the population through sexual recombination. They might be disadvantageous now, but they could become advantageous in the future as the parasite landscape changes.
So sex is like a way of storing genetic diversity for future use, even if some of that diversity isn't immediately useful.
That's right. It's a way of preparing for the unexpected.
And it's interesting that even parasites themselves often engage in sexual reproduction. Why would that be?
Well, they're in an arms race too. They need to keep evolving to overcome the defenses of their hosts. And if their hosts are sexually reproducing, constantly changing their genetic makeup, the parasites need to do the same to keep up.
So it's a red queen race happening on both sides of the host-parasite relationship.
Exactly. It's a never-ending co-evolutionary dance.
Now, we've got some compelling theoretical arguments and even computer models supporting the red queen hypothesis. But what about real-world evidence?
There's a growing body of empirical support for the Red Queen. One elegant study was done by Curtis Lively, who was working with freshwater snails in New Zealand.
Snails. What do they have to do with the red queen?
Well, Lively observed that snail populations with higher levels of parasite infection also had a significantly higher proportion of males.
More males, more sex.
Exactly. This directly supports the prediction that more parasites should favor more sex because sex generates the genetic diversity needed to combat those parasites.
It's like the snails are ramping up their sexual reproduction in response to the increased parasite threat.
Precisely. And Lively did another study, this time with top minnows in Mexico. He was looking at populations of sexual top minnows and asexual hybrid clones.
So some top minnows reproduce sexually and others reproduce asexually.
Right. And Lively found that the asexual clones were much more susceptible to black spot disease, a common parasitic infection.
So the sexual top minnows were better at resisting the parasite.
Yes, and what's even more interesting is that within the asexual clones, the most genetically uniform clones suffered the highest rates of parasitism.
So the more genetically diverse the top minnows were, the better they were at fighting off the parasite.
Exactly. It's like the parasite was specifically targeting the most common genetic locks in the asexual population.
It's a powerful piece of evidence directly linking the prevalence of parasites to the advantage of sexual reproduction.
It is, and it's one of many studies that have provided empirical support for the Red Queen hypothesis.
Now, we've talked a lot about the pressure from parasites, but what about the role of mate choice in all of this?
Ah, yes, sexual selection. It adds another layer to the complexity of sex and its benefits.
So it's not just about surviving parasites, it's also about attracting a mate and ensuring that your genes are passed on.
Right. And this introduces all sorts of interesting dynamics. We've talked about things like Fisherian runaway selection, where a preference for a specific trait in one sex can lead to increasingly exaggerated versions of that trait in the other sex.
Like the peacock's tail.
Exactly. The more elaborate the tail, the more attractive the male is to females, leading to a runaway selection for ever larger tails.
And then there's the good genes hypothesis, where elaborate displays might signal underlying genetic quality and health.
Right. The idea is that these displays are costly, so only individuals with really good genes can afford to produce them.
But there's also a problem with this idea, right? The so-called Leck paradox.
Yes. The paradox is that if females are consistently choosing males with the best genes, you'd expect the genetic variation for those desirable traits to disappear over time.
So everyone would end up with the same best genes, and there wouldn't be any variation left for selection to act on.
Exactly. But this clearly isn't the case. There's still plenty of genetic variation in populations.
So how do we resolve this paradox?
Well, one solution is to bring the Red Queen back into the picture. Hamilton and Marlene Zuk proposed that parasites could be the constantly changing selective pressure that maintains genetic variation relevant to mate choice.
So females aren't just choosing mates with good genes in general. They're choosing mates with genes that are currently effective at resisting the prevailing parasites.
Precisely. And because the parasite landscape is always changing, so too are the genes that confer resistance.
It's like a never-ending game of genetic catch-up.
Exactly. And this means that those elaborate displays, the bright colors, the intricate dances, might not just be arbitrary aesthetic preferences. They might be honest advertisements of an individual's ability to resist parasites.
So the more flamboyant the display, the more parasite-free the individual.
That's the idea. And there's evidence to support this. Species with more elaborate displays often tend to have more parasites.
More parasites, more pressure to evolve elaborate displays to signal parasite resistance.
That's right. And within a species, males with more impressive ornaments often have fewer parasites and are more attractive to females.
So the females are choosing mates who are best equipped to fight off the current parasite threats, ensuring that their offspring inherit those valuable resistance genes.
Precisely. And Ridley highlights a fascinating study by Zook on junglefowl, the wild ancestors of domestic chickens.
What did she find?
Zook showed that female junglefowl strongly preferred males with healthy-looking combs and eyes.
Why those features?
Well, it turns out that the comb and eyes are good indicators of the bird's overall health. If they're dull or discolored, it's a sign of parasitic infection.
So the females are using those features as cues to assess the male's parasite load.
Exactly, and they're choosing mates who appear to be healthy and parasite-free.
It's amazing how these seemingly arbitrary preferences can actually be deeply rooted in the evolutionary arms race against parasites.
It is, but it's also important to remember that not all sexual signaling is necessarily honest.
What do you mean?
Well, Dawkins and Krebs, two other evolutionary biologists, pointed out that animal communication, including sexual displays, can involve elements of manipulation or deception.
It's like advertising. Sometimes the claims are exaggerated or misleading.
Exactly. The cost for males to perfectly discern genuine signals of health and quality from potentially deceptive ones might be too high, so some level of dishonesty can persist.
So it's not always a straightforward case of honest advertising.
No, it can be a complex interplay of honesty, manipulation, and the constant pressure to outmaneuver both rivals and parasites.
Now let's shift our focus a bit to human mating systems. I mean, we see a huge variety of mating patterns across different cultures.
Human mating systems are indeed incredibly complex and diverse, and they're shaped by a combination of biological, cultural, and ecological factors.
We see everything from monogamy, where two individuals form a pair bond, to polygamy, where individuals have multiple spouses.
And these different systems likely reflect different evolutionary pressures and trade-offs.
For example, in polygynous systems where males can potentially sire many offspring, there might be stronger selection for males to compete for access to females.
Whereas in monogamous systems, where both parents typically invest heavily in raising their offspring, there might be stronger selection for cooperation and pair bonding.
And Ridley mentions the Travers-Willard hypothesis. Can you explain that?
The Travers-Willard hypothesis proposes that parents in good condition might be more likely to invest in sons because sons have the potential for higher reproductive success in polygynous mating systems.
Because a high-quality male can potentially father many offspring if he can outcompete his rivals.
Exactly. But parents in poorer condition might be more likely to invest in daughters because daughters have a more stable reproductive rate, less dependent on their own condition.
So the sex ratio of offspring might be influenced by the parent's condition.
That's the idea. It's a fascinating hypothesis that has some support in both animal and human studies.
It's a reminder that even something as seemingly fundamental as sex is influenced by a complex web of factors.
Absolutely. And it highlights the importance of considering multiple levels of analysis, from genes to individuals to populations to societies. Now, Ridley concludes The Red Queen with a rather provocative idea.
Yes, he suggests that the evolution of human intelligence itself might be a product of sexual selection.
So our big brains, our capacity for abstract thought, our ability to philosophize, it's all because we were trying to impress potential mates.
Well, that's the argument put forward by Geoffrey Miller. He proposes that uniquely human traits like wit, humor, creativity, language, and complex problem-solving might have evolved not primarily for survival in the ecological sense, but because they were attractive to the opposite sex.
That's like the peacock's tail, but for humans, it's our minds that are on display.
Exactly. And this idea has generated a lot of debate and research. It's a fascinating and controversial hypothesis that challenges us to reconsider the very origins of what we consider uniquely human.
It is, and it brings us full circle to the importance of understanding the deep evolutionary forces that have shaped us.
So, to sum up for our listeners, especially those of you grappling with the complexities of governing and leading societies, sex is far more than just a means of reproduction.
It's a fundamental evolutionary strategy that plays crucial roles in DNA repair, the elimination of harmful mutations, adaptation to changing environments, and perhaps most importantly, surviving the constant arms race with parasites.
And it's this process of sex that generates both the incredible diversity within populations, allowing for adaptation and resilience, and the underlying homogeneity that defines a species.
This understanding provides a powerful lens for understanding the individuals within your realm, their motivations, their behaviors, and the societies they create.
It's a reminder that even the most complex social structures have their roots in fundamental biological imperatives.
And that by understanding these imperatives, we can gain a deeper appreciation for the challenges and opportunities of leading and shaping societies.
It's certainly a lot to contemplate. If you're intrigued by these ideas, we highly recommend diving into The Red Queen by Matt Ridley. It's a truly eye-opening exploration of the evolutionary forces that have shaped life on Earth, and it offers profound insights into the very nature of our own species.
And perhaps it might even offer some unexpected guidance as you navigate the complexities of your own realm.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.